December 25, 1945. The war had been over for 7 months, but for Margaret Schultz, a 34-year-old mother of 3 from Dresden, the real shock came not from bombs or battles, but from a simple invitation. Standing in the doorway of her partially rebuilt home on the outskirts of the American occupation zone, Margaret stared in disbelief at the young American sergeant who had just invited her entire family to Christmas dinner at the U.S. military base. What Sergeant James Miller couldn't possibly understand was that this simple act of kindness defied 12 years of carefully constructed Nazi propaganda about the barbaric American enemy. Margaretta's hands trembled as she clutched the printed invitation card. According to everything she had been taught by Goebbels's Ministry of Propaganda, Americans were uncultured savages who would sooner shoot her children than feed them. Yet here stood a smiling young man from Kansas extending an olive branch in the form of turkey and cranberry sauce. What Margaret saw in the coming hours would defy more than a decade of indoctrination and force her to question everything she believed about her former enemies and, ultimately, about the regime she had once supported. The invitation was not unique to Margaret. That Christmas, in the American occupation zone, more than 6,000 German families were invited to share holiday meals with the soldiers who, just months before, had been dropping bombs on their cities. This remarkable shift from mortal enemies to dinner guests represented one of the most profound psychological operations of the post-war period, though it wasn't designed as such. Rather, it was a spontaneous act of humanity that accomplished what no strategic bombing campaign or political re-education program could achieve. It shattered the carefully constructed myths of Nazi propaganda through the simple evidence of American abundance. To understand the profound impact of these Christmas dinners, we must first comprehend the web of lies that had been woven around the German population about America. From 1933 to 1945, Joseph Goebbels orchestrated a massive propaganda campaign designed to portray Americans as culturally inferior, morally bankrupt, and economically desperate. According to Nazi propaganda, the United States was a nation in decline, plagued by unemployment, crime, and racial degeneracy. German newsreels showed carefully selected footage of Depression-era breadlines and Dust Bowl refugees, presenting them as the true face of America. German newspapers regularly reported on supposed food shortages in American cities, claiming that while Germany enjoyed the prosperity of the economic miracle under National Socialism, Americans were struggling to feed themselves. By 1940, when the United States had not yet entered the war, German propaganda shifted to portray Americans as war profiteers, selling weapons to Britain while their own people suffered. After Pearl Harbor, the messaging changed again, now describing Americans as poorly trained, ill-equipped soldiers who lacked the discipline and racial purity of the German Wehrmacht. A particularly insidious element of this propaganda was the portrayal of American soldiers as criminals and rapists who would inflict terrible violence on German civilians if they ever reached German soil. Goebbels' ministry distributed pamphlets throughout Germany describing fabricated atrocities committed by American troops in Italy and France. One widely circulated piece of propaganda claimed that American soldiers received bounties for the ears of German civilians. The economic dimension of this propaganda was equally important. Germans were told that the United States was still suffering from the Great Depression, that its industrial capacity was inferior to Germany's, and that American consumer goods were of poor quality compared to superior German engineering. According to Nazi economists, America's capitalist system was on the verge of collapse, unable to sustain the war effort against the more efficient National Socialist economic model. Germans were taught that while they might experience temporary hardships due to the demands of war, these sacrifices were nothing compared to the desperate conditions in America. This propaganda was remarkably effective, particularly among Germans who had never traveled abroad or interacted with Americans. A survey conducted by Allied Intelligence in May 1945 found that 77% of Germans believed the United States was still suffering from widespread unemployment and food shortages. 64% believed American industrial production was inferior to German output. And perhaps most tellingly, 89% expressed fear of how they would be treated by American occupation forces. The reality, of course, was dramatically different. By 1945, the United States had achieved unprecedented economic output. American factories were producing a new aircraft every 5 minutes, a new ship every day, and more than 12,000 vehicles per day. While Germans had endured years of increasing rationing, down to less than 1,500 calories per day by war's end, the average American civilian was consuming more than 3,000 calories daily. The American military was the best supplied in human history, with logistics systems capable of delivering everything from fresh turkey to ice cream to troops at the front lines. This stark contrast between propaganda and reality created the perfect conditions for cognitive dissonance when Germans finally encountered real Americans. Nowhere was this more evident than in the American occupation zone in the months following Germany's surrender. As American troops established bases throughout Bavaria, Hesse, and parts of what would become West Berlin, they brought with them an unprecedented level of material abundance that directly contradicted years of propaganda. For Margarete Schultz and her children, 10-year-old Hans, 8-year-old Frieda, and 6-year-old Kurt, the journey to the American base on that Christmas morning was fraught with anxiety. Her husband Karl, a former postal worker who had been drafted into the Wehrmacht in 1942, was still missing, presumed dead or captured on the Eastern Front. The family had survived the firebombing of Dresden only because they had been visiting relatives in a small village 20 kilometers away. Their home had been partially destroyed, and they had spent the spring and summer of 1945 rebuilding what they could. Food was scarce. The children had not tasted chocolate in more than 3 years. Meat appeared on their table perhaps once a month, usually in the form of rabbit, or, when they were lucky, a piece of pork obtained through barter with farmers outside the city. As they approached the American base, a former Wehrmacht barracks that now flew the Stars and Stripes, Hans clutched his mother's hand tightly. "Will they shoot us?" he whispered, repeating a fear instilled by years of propaganda films shown at his school. Margaret couldn't honestly answer. Despite the kind demeanor of Sergeant Miller, she too harbored deep fears about what might await them. Perhaps this was some kind of trick, a way to humiliate Germans further, or to interrogate them about neighbors who might have been Nazi Party members. Or worse, maybe the stories about American brutality were true. What they found instead was a scene that would permanently alter their understanding of both their former enemies and their former government. The barracks mess hall had been transformed with Christmas decorations, real pine garlands, colored lights, and a massive Christmas tree adorned with tinsel and ornaments. Tables were covered with white cloths and set with plates, silverware, and glasses. A band played Silent Night in the corner, the familiar melody providing a momentary comfort in this alien setting. But it was the food that truly shocked them. Long tables lined the walls, laden with dishes that Marguerite had not seen since before the war. Whole roasted turkeys, hams glazed with brown sugar, mountains of mashed potatoes, gravy boats the size of flower vases, cranberry sauce, yams, green beans, corn, freshly baked bread, and pies of every description, apple, pumpkin, pecan, and cherry. The abundance was incomprehensible. There, in one room, was more food than Margaret had seen in the past year combined. Master Sergeant Frank Dominguez, the mess hall supervisor, approached the stunned family. "Merry Christmas," he said in accented German. "Please, eat as much as you like. This is American Christmas." He handed small packages to each of the children, gifts wrapped in colorful paper. Inside they found chocolate bars, chewing gum, and small toys manufactured in the United States. Hans received a toy airplane, Frieda a small doll, and Kurt a set of marbles. The children stood frozen, unable to comprehend this generosity from the people they had been taught to fear and hate. Margarete watched as her children were led to a table by a young private who served them plates, piled high with food. Tears formed in her eyes, not just from the unexpected kindness, but from the devastating realization that everything she had believed, everything she had taught her children about Americans, had been a lie. If this was the enemy, what did that make the government she had supported? The Schultz family was not alone in their experience. At that same Christmas dinner, Wilhelm Müller, a 47-year-old former factory manager and Nazi party member, though he had conveniently lost his party pin by the time of surrender, sat rigid with shock as he watched American soldiers serve his granddaughter, Heidi, a second helping of ice cream. Wilhelm had risen through the ranks of German industry during the 1930s, eventually overseeing a factory that produced components for Messerschmitt aircraft. He had attended economic briefings where high-ranking officials presented charts and statistics proving German industrial superiority. He had seen the confidential reports on American production capabilities, which claimed that U.S. factories could produce perhaps a few hundred aircraft per month, compared to the thousands supposedly rolling off German assembly lines. Yet here he was, watching American soldiers casually discard half-eaten slices of pie into trash cans, food that would have been treasured in his household. When Corporal Thomas Jenkins noticed Wilhelm's expression, he misinterpreted the German's shock as a desire for more dessert. "Here," Jenkins said, cutting a massive slice of apple pie and adding a scoop of ice cream on top. "We've got plenty." Those 3 words, "we've got plenty," hit Wilhelm like a physical blow. In that moment, he began to comprehend the scale of the lies he had believed. If the Americans could waste food so casually, if they could produce such abundance even while fighting a global war, then everything Wilhelm had been told about American industrial capacity was wrong. And if that was wrong, what else was false? The cognitive dissonance was physically painful, manifesting as a tightness in his chest that he initially feared was a heart attack. At another table sat Dr. Elsa Hoffman, a 39-year-old physician who had served in a military hospital in Munich. Dr. Hoffman had treated wounded soldiers throughout the war and had seen firsthand the deterioration in German medical supplies. By 1944, German hospitals were reusing bandages, sterilizing them through boiling when possible. Morphine was so scarce that it was reserved only for the most severe cases or for officers. Penicillin, which American forces had in abundance, was virtually non-existent in German field hospitals. Dr. Hoffman had been invited to the Christmas dinner by Captain Robert Williams, a military doctor who had been impressed by her work with displaced children in the refugee center, where she now volunteered. As they ate, Captain Williams casually mentioned that the base hospital had received a new shipment of antibiotics the previous week. "Enough to treat the entire population of Munich if necessary," he remarked, without exaggeration. Dr. Hoffman set down her fork. "How can you possibly have so much? We were told American hospitals were undersupplied, that your pharmaceutical industry couldn't produce enough, even for your own troops." Captain Williams looked confused. "We've been mass-producing penicillin since '43, he explained. "Every American field hospital has more than they can use. That's why we've been distributing the surplus to German hospitals." Dr. Hoffman thought about the German soldiers who had died of infections that could have been easily treated with the medicine that American troops apparently had in surplus. She thought about the propaganda broadcasts she had heard describing American soldiers dying of simple infections due to medicine shortages. The disconnect between these stories and the reality sitting across from her was too vast to process all at once. For the more than 6,000 German families who attended Christmas dinners at American bases throughout the occupation zone, similar revelations were unfolding. They were experiencing firsthand what Allied intelligence officers called the most effective denazification program, though it wasn't designed as a program at all. It was simply the unavoidable exposure to American abundance after years of carefully constructed propaganda. This abundance manifested in ways both large and small. Otto Bauer, a mechanic from Frankfurt, found himself in conversation with an American motor pool sergeant who casually mentioned that each American division had more than 2,000 vehicles, a number Otto initially assumed was an exaggeration or a translation error. But when the sergeant took him on an impromptu tour of the motor pool, Otto saw row after row of jeeps, trucks, half-tracks, and tanks, more vehicles in one place than he had seen in the final 2 years of the war combined. The Germans had been reduced to using horses for transport by 1944, while American troops had vehicles to spare. 14-year-old Dieter Kruger, who had been a dedicated member of the Hitler Youth until the regime's collapse, received another kind of education when he was allowed to flip through a mail-order catalog that an American private had received from home. The Sears Roebuck catalog, with its hundreds of pages of consumer goods available to ordinary Americans, contradicted everything Dieter had been taught about American poverty. He stared in disbelief at the variety of shoes, clothing, household appliances, and toys that seemed to be available to anyone with money to purchase them. In Germany, such items had gradually disappeared from shops, replaced by ersatz products of declining quality, with everything from coffee to clothing made from inferior substitute materials. "You can buy all of these things?" Dieter asked, pointing to a page showing different models of radios. "Sure," replied Private Eddie Kowalski. "My mom got me that one there for my birthday before I shipped out." He pointed to a mid-priced model. "But I thought," Dieter began, then stopped himself. "Thought what?" Kowalski asked. "We were told Americans could not afford such things, that there were shortages of everything." Kowalski laughed. "Shortages? Buddy, we've got more stuff than we know what to do with. My little sister works part-time at a soda fountain and saved up enough to buy herself a bicycle in 3 months." For Dieter, who had spent the past year scavenging for food and firewood, the idea of a teenager working part-time to buy luxury items was incomprehensible. His father had been employed full-time at a factory and could barely keep the family fed in the final years of the war. The contrast was too stark to dismiss as mere enemy propaganda. It demanded a complete reevaluation of everything he had been taught. The revelations continued as the Christmas dinners progressed. For many Germans, it was not just the quantity of food that shocked them, but its quality and variety. Helga Schmidt, a housewife from Heidelberg, found herself examining an orange, a fruit she had not seen since 1940. When she commented on this to the American WAC, Women's Army Corps officer who had provided it, the woman responded with genuine surprise. "Really? We get shipments of oranges and other fresh fruits every week. The boys complain if they don't have fresh orange juice at breakfast." The implication was staggering. While German civilians had subsisted on increasingly meager rations of poor-quality bread, turnips, and whatever they could grow in victory gardens, American soldiers received regular shipments of fresh fruits and vegetables, transported thousands of miles from farms in California and Florida. The logistical capabilities this suggested were far beyond what German propaganda had claimed was possible. For Friedrich Weber, a former economics professor at Heidelberg University who had reluctantly joined the Nazi Party to maintain his position, the Christmas dinner provided empirical evidence that invalidated 12 years of economic theory as taught under National Socialism. Throughout the 1930s, Weber had been required to teach that the American capitalist system was inefficient and inherently unstable compared to the German economic model. According to Nazi economic theory, the profit motive led to wasteful competition and luxury production that benefited only the wealthy, while the German system of state-directed production ensured efficient use of resources for the benefit of all citizens. Yet here before him was proof of the opposite. American capitalism had produced such abundance that even enlisted soldiers lived better than middle-class Germans had before the war. And this abundance extended to ordinary citizens back home, as evidenced by the letters and packages the soldiers received. Meanwhile, the supposedly superior German economic system had resulted in critical shortages of everything from fuel to food, even before Allied bombing had significantly impacted production. Weber found himself in conversation with Lieutenant Paul Davidson, a former economics student from the University of Chicago who now served as a logistics officer. As they discussed supply chains and production capacity, Weber's professional curiosity overcame his personal discomfort. "Is it true," he asked carefully, that American factories produced more than 96,000 aircraft in 1944 alone? Lieutenant Davidson considered the question. That sounds about right. I know we were turning out about 8,000 a month by the end of '44. Ford's Willow Run plant was completing a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes at peak production. Weber set down his coffee cup with a shaking hand. The numbers were incomprehensible. Germany's total aircraft production for 1944 had been approximately 40,000 planes, less than half the American output. And this was just one category of war materiel. When he had expressed doubts about the production figures presented in official briefings, Weber had been warned about defeatism and reminded of his duty to maintain confidence in the final victory. Now he understood why such doubts were treated as near treason. The reality was too devastating to acknowledge. As the Christmas dinners continued into the afternoon, many Germans experienced another shock: the behavior of the American soldiers themselves. After years of being told that Americans were undisciplined, crude, and violent, they instead encountered young men who were polite, generous, and particularly kind to children. Contrary to propaganda that had portrayed black American soldiers as especially dangerous, German families found themselves served by black GIs, who displayed the same professionalism and friendliness as their white counterparts. A direct contradiction to Nazi racial ideology. Johanna Beck, a widowed mother of 2 from Munich, had been particularly terrified of black American soldiers, having been subjected to vicious propaganda about their supposed savagery. When Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson, a black soldier from Georgia, approached her table with a pot of coffee, she instinctively pulled her children closer. Sergeant Johnson noticed her fear, but responded with a gentle smile, carefully pouring coffee into her cup and offering cream and sugar. He then produced 2 chocolate bars from his pocket and, after a questioning glance at Johanna for permission, gave them to her wide-eyed children. This small act of kindness created a moment of profound cognitive dissonance for Johanna. How could she reconcile this gentle man with the monstrous caricatures she had been shown in propaganda films? The disconnect was too great to maintain both beliefs simultaneously. Either this man was an exception, or the entire propaganda narrative was false. As she watched Sergeant Johnson move throughout the room displaying the same kindness to other German families, the evidence increasingly supported the latter conclusion. For the American soldiers, these Christmas dinners served multiple purposes. While many genuinely wished to share their holiday with local civilians as an act of goodwill, military leaders also recognized the strategic value of demonstrating American prosperity. General Lucius Clay, deputy military governor of the American occupation zone, had encouraged these community outreach efforts, understanding that American abundance could accomplish what no amount of political re-education might achieve. Let them see for themselves, Clay had instructed his officers. They've been told we're barbarians and paupers. The truth is our strongest weapon. This truth was delivered not through lectures or pamphlets, but through the irrefutable evidence of abundance that no propaganda could explain away. When German children who had not tasted chocolate in years suddenly received not just one piece but entire bars to themselves, when families who had been subsisting on bread and turnips were offered second and third helpings of meat, the contrast between propaganda and reality became too stark to ignore. The psychological impact was profound and measurable. Allied intelligence officers who interviewed Germans before and after such encounters documented a significant shift in attitudes. Before direct exposure to American abundance, many Germans clung to propaganda narratives as a psychological defense mechanism. Admitting they had been deceived meant confronting their support for a regime that had led Germany to catastrophic defeat. After experiencing American abundance firsthand, maintaining these beliefs became cognitively impossible. A report prepared for the Office of Military Government, United States, OMGUS, in January 1946 documented this shift. Exposure to American material abundance produces more rapid abandonment of Nazi economic beliefs than any direct counter-propaganda. Germans who have dined with American families or visited American facilities consistently report profound reassessment of previous beliefs about American industrial and agricultural capacity. This reassessment extended beyond material comparisons to fundamental questions about the nature of the Nazi regime itself. If the government had lied so comprehensively about American economic conditions, what else had been false? This questioning created an opening for broader denazification efforts that might otherwise have faced stronger psychological resistance. For Margarete Schultz, this questioning began as she watched her son Hans receive a second helping of turkey from an American soldier who introduced himself as Private Tony Esposito from New Jersey. Hans, who had been the most frightened of American soldiers due to his extensive exposure to propaganda films at school, now sat comfortably chatting with Private Esposito about baseball, a sport completely unknown to the German. Boy, but described with such enthusiasm by the American that Hans was soon asking detailed questions about teams and rules. Margaret found herself in conversation with Lieutenant Sarah Cohen, a Jewish-American WSIC officer who had helped organize the Christmas dinner. The lieutenant spoke decent German, having studied the language before the war, and explained that she was part of a team working to restore school services for German children. "Your children will be able to return to school in January," Lieutenant Cohen explained. "We're printing new textbooks without the previous material." The delicate phrasing, avoiding direct mention of Nazi content, struck Margaret. This Jewish-American officer, who by all rights might have harbored deep resentment toward Germans, was instead focused on helping German children resume their education. It was another contradiction that demanded resolution. Either the stories about Jewish vengeance were false, or this woman was an inexplicable exception. As the afternoon progressed, these contradictions multiplied, creating an overwhelming cognitive burden for many German guests. Werner Hoffmann, a former Wehrmacht lieutenant who had lost his left arm on the Eastern Front, found himself struggling with particularly acute dissonance. As a junior officer, Hoffmann had received regular briefings on enemy capabilities, including assessments of American equipment, training, and morale. He had been told repeatedly that American soldiers were poorly trained, their equipment was inferior, and their morale was low due to lack of conviction in their cause. Yet the Americans Hoffmann met at the Christmas dinner were clearly well-trained professionals with superior equipment and high morale, despite being thousands of miles from home during a holiday season. Their uniforms were of better quality than anything the Wehrmacht had issued in the final years of the war. Their boots, a particular point of comparison for any soldier, were sturdy, well-made leather compared to the deteriorating quality of German footwear that had increasingly incorporated substitute materials as the war progressed. When Captain Michael Reynolds learned of Hoffmann's military service, he invited the former Wehrmacht officer to visit the base's motor pool and armory later that week. Professional courtesy, the captain called it. During that subsequent visit, Hoffmann saw firsthand the equipment that had defeated the supposedly superior German forces. Tanks with reliable engines and transmissions, unlike the German Tigers and Panthers that had frequently broken down, weapons that prioritized reliability and ease of maintenance over theoretical performance, and an abundance of spare parts that German units could only dream of in the war's final years. Most shocking to Hoffmann was learning that the equipment he saw represented not the best American technology, but merely standard issue. Captain Reynolds casually mentioned that many of their tanks and vehicles were already considered obsolete, with newer models being produced but deemed unnecessary to ship overseas now that the war was over. The revelation that Americans considered obsolete equipment that outclassed Germany's best offerings delivered a final blow to Hoffmann's professional pride and to the myths of German technological superiority he had believed. For many Germans, the Christmas dinners of 1945 marked the beginning of a painful but necessary reevaluation of their recent past. The abundance they witnessed could not be dismissed as propaganda or exceptional displays created to impress them. It was too comprehensive, too casual, too consistent with what they observed throughout the American occupation zone. The soldiers wasted food that would have been precious in German households, not as a deliberate insult, but because such abundance was normal to them. They offered seconds and thirds not as a special gesture, but as routine hospitality. This casualness was perhaps the most convincing aspect of the demonstration. Had the Americans arranged a single lavish feast as a propaganda exercise, Germans might have dismissed it as theatrical. But the everyday nature of American abundance, the way soldiers treated extraordinary luxury as ordinary, made it impossible to explain away. This wasn't a show put on for German benefit. It was simply Americans being Americans, revealing a standard of living that Nazi propaganda had denied was possible. The impact extended beyond the Christmas dinners themselves. Germans who attended these events shared their experiences with neighbors, friends, and relatives, creating a ripple effect of reevaluation. Louise Wagner, who attended a Christmas dinner at an American base near Stuttgart, later wrote in her diary, "I have seen with my own eyes what we were told did not exist. How can I continue to believe anything we were told? If they lied about this, something so easily disproven, they must have lied about everything." This sentiment was echoed in countless private conversations throughout the American occupation zone in the weeks following Christmas 1945. Germans who had dismissed Allied news broadcasts as propaganda were now more willing to consider that other aspects of Allied messaging, including revelations about Nazi atrocities, might be true. The cognitive opening created by the irrefutable evidence of American abundance created space for accepting more difficult truths. For the American occupation authorities, this represented an unexpected success in their denazification efforts. Rather than having to convince Germans through argument or force them through authority, the simple reality of American life accomplished what might otherwise have taken years of re-education. Germans who experienced American abundance firsthand became, in many cases, the most effective advocates for democratic and economic reform, having seen compelling evidence that the American system produced better outcomes than what they had experienced under National Socialism. This was particularly true among the younger Germans who attended these dinners. For children and teenagers whose entire lives had been shaped by Nazi education and propaganda, the Christmas dinners offered a competing reality that was difficult to reconcile with what they had been taught. 16-year-old Emma Fischer, who had been a leader in the League of German Girls, BDM, found her ideological foundations shattered by what she witnessed at an American base in Frankfurt. "They gave us oranges as if they were as common as potatoes," she later recalled in an oral history recorded in the 1970s. "I had not tasted an orange in 6 years, and here was this American girl my age asking if I wanted another as if it was nothing special. That's when I knew everything I had been taught was built on lies, not just small lies, but enormous, elaborate fabrications designed to keep us believing in a system that could not possibly compete with what the Americans had built." This realization was repeated in thousands of individual experiences throughout the Christmas season of 1945. Each German who attended these dinners underwent a personal journey from propaganda-induced expectations to a reality that contradicted everything they had been told. This journey was not just about food or material goods, although these were the most immediate and visible contradictions, but about confronting the comprehensive nature of the deception they had experienced. For many, this confrontation was painful and disorienting. Adults who had invested years of belief and support in the Nazi regime had to face not only its defeat, but its fundamental dishonesty. The psychological defense mechanisms were strong. Some initially insisted that what they were seeing must be exceptional, a special display created to impress or mislead them. But as exposure to American abundance continued beyond that Christmas season, as they observed the everyday lives of occupation forces and the growing stream of American consumer goods, maintaining this denial became impossible. By the spring of 1946, surveys conducted by occupation authorities found a marked shift in German attitudes toward Americans and toward their own recent past. Germans who had direct contact with American troops and their material culture were significantly more likely to reject Nazi economic theories and to express openness to democratic reforms. They were also more likely to acknowledge broader truths about the Nazi period, including its crimes, not because they had been forced to through re-education programs, but because the proven falsehood of economic propaganda made other official narratives suspect as well. This shift was particularly evident in cities and towns with significant American military presence, where ongoing interaction reinforced the initial shock of the Christmas dinners. In Heidelberg, where the U.S. Army established its European headquarters, the transformation was especially pronounced. Local residents who interacted regularly with American personnel began to adopt new standards of comparison for economic success, measuring German recovery against American abundance rather than against the artificial benchmarks of the Nazi period. By 1947, this shift was manifesting in political attitudes as well. Support for economic reforms aligned with the emerging social market economy was strongest in areas with high exposure to American material culture. Germans who had witnessed American abundance firsthand were more likely to reject both Nazi economic models and Soviet-style centralized planning, instead favoring a regulated market economy that might eventually produce similar prosperity. This influence played a crucial role in the economic miracle, Wirtschaftswunder, that would transform West Germany in the 1950s. The Germans who had experienced American abundance became some of the strongest advocates for economic liberalization, understanding from direct observation that market economies could produce living standards that centrally planned economies could not match. This wasn't theoretical knowledge gained from propaganda in either direction. It was empirical evidence experienced through all five senses during encounters like the Christmas dinners of 1945. For individuals like Margaret Schultz, the transformation continued long after that Christmas day. In March 1946, Margareta received unexpected news. Her husband Karl was alive, having been captured by Soviet forces and held in a labor camp. When he was finally released and returned to Dresden in August 1946, Karl found a wife and children whose worldview had fundamentally changed. While Karl had experienced the harshness of Soviet captivity, reinforcing some aspects of anti-communist propaganda he had been taught, Margarete and the children had experienced the contradiction of American abundance. Their reunion required a painful reconciliation of these different experiences, a process mirrored in countless German households as families separated by war came together to make sense of contradictory realities. For Karl, who had been a nominal Nazi Party member and had fully believed in German superiority, accepting Margaret's new understanding was difficult. But the evidence continued to accumulate as the occupation progressed. The contrast between conditions in the Soviet and American zones became impossible to ignore, providing ongoing confirmation of what Margaret had glimpsed that Christmas day. By 1948, when the family made the difficult decision to leave their home in what was becoming East Germany and move to Frankfurt in the American zone, Karl, too, had been convinced by the mounting evidence that the economic system he had once supported had been built on fundamental deceptions. The Schultz family's journey was repeated with variations across Germany as individuals and families reconstructed their understanding of recent history based on new evidence that contradicted what they had been taught. This reconstruction was rarely easy or straightforward. It required admitting not only that they had been deceived, but that they had participated in their own deception, that they had chosen to believe comfortable lies rather than confront uncomfortable realities. For some, like Werner Hoffmann, the former Wehrmacht lieutenant, this reckoning led to a complete rejection of his military service and the cause it had served. By 1947, Hoffmann had become an outspoken advocate for democratic reforms and had taken a position with the new civil administration, where he worked closely with American advisors on reconstruction projects. His first-hand knowledge of both German military limitations and American capabilities made him particularly effective at countering lingering myths about the war among his fellow veterans. For others, like Friedrich Weber, the economics professor, the reckoning took a more academic form. Weber dedicated himself to understanding where German economic theory had gone wrong, studying American economic models, and eventually helping to develop the theoretical framework for the social market economy that would guide West German development. His lectures at Heidelberg in the late 1940s directly addressed the myths he had once taught, using the evidence of American productive capacity to illustrate the flaws in Nazi economic theory. The Christmas dinners of 1945 thus represent more than a heartwarming story of reconciliation amid the ruins of war. They were catalysts for a profound psychological and ideological transformation, moments when the gap between propaganda and reality became too wide to bridge through denial or rationalization. For thousands of Germans, these dinners marked the point at which the cognitive dissonance became too great to sustain, when the evidence before their eyes, in their hands and on their tongues, forced a fundamental reassessment of beliefs they had held for over a decade. The transformative power of this experience was not lost on American occupation authorities, who increasingly incorporated material abundance into their strategy for German democratization. General Lucius Clay noted in his memoirs that the most effective weapon in our psychological arsenal was not our arguments, but our example, not what we said about democracy, but what democracy visibly produced. This insight informed the implementation of the Marshall Plan, which recognized that economic recovery and material improvement would do more to secure democratic values than political re-education alone. For the Germans who experienced that Christmas of 1945 in the American occupation zone, the journey from enemy to ally began not with political declarations, but with turkey, chocolate, and oranges, with tangible evidence that everything they had been told about their former enemies was wrong. The psychological impact of this realization extended far beyond questions of material prosperity to fundamental reassessments of the regime they had supported and the values that would guide Germany's future. As Margaret Schultz walked home with her children that Christmas evening, each carrying leftovers and gifts provided by their American hosts, 6-year-old Kurt asked a question that captured this transformation in its simplest form. "Mother, if they lied about the Americans, did they lie about everything else too?" Margaret had no ready answer, but the question itself marked the beginning of a new understanding, not just for her family, but for a nation beginning the long process of confronting deception and rebuilding on a foundation of truth. The Christmas dinners of 1945 had cracked open a door to that truth, allowing Germans to glimpse a reality beyond the narrow confines of the world they had been taught to believe in. What they saw through that door would help shape the next 70 years of German history. The legacy of these encounters extended far beyond the immediate post-war period. Many of the German children who experienced American abundance in 1945 grew up to become the architects and supporters of the transatlantic partnership that would define West German foreign policy throughout the Cold War. Their personal experiences of American generosity created an emotional foundation for political alliance that proved remarkably durable despite the inevitable tensions of international relations. When Konrad Adenauer negotiated West Germany's integration into NATO in the early 1950s, his diplomatic efforts were supported by a population that included thousands of Germans whose first positive encounter with Americans had come during those Christmas dinners of 1945. The political alignment between West Germany and the United States rested not just on strategic calculations about the Soviet threat, but on personal experiences that had transformed former enemies into trusted partners. This transformation was particularly evident during the Berlin airlift of 1948 and 1949, when American and British aircraft delivered more than 2 million tons of supplies to West Berliners blockaded by Soviet forces. For many Germans, the airlift confirmed what they had glimpsed during those Christmas dinners. American abundance was not a temporary wartime achievement, but a sustainable reality, capable of feeding an entire city from the air when necessary. The children who had received chocolate and toys from American soldiers in 1945 were now teenagers watching C-47 transport planes land at Tempelhof Airport every few minutes, delivering everything from flour and coal to candy for the famous candy bombers to drop on parachutes. The message was the same, writ larger. American abundance was reliable, generous, and stood in stark contrast to the scarcity imposed by the competing system to the east. By the 1960s, as West Germany achieved its own economic miracle, the memory of those Christmas dinners took on an almost mythological quality for the generation that had experienced them. They became origin stories for the new German-American relationship, personal touchstones that helped explain the broader geopolitical alliance. When asked in oral history projects why Germany had aligned so closely with the United States after being bitter enemies, many Germans of that generation pointed not to abstract geopolitical theories, but to concrete experiences of American generosity and abundance during the occupation period. For Margarete Schultz, who lived until 1989, long enough to see the Berlin Wall fall, that Christmas dinner remained a defining moment in her understanding of history and politics. In an interview conducted in the 1980s, she recalled how the experience had immunized her family against communist propaganda in the early years of the German Democratic Republic before they moved west. When the Soviet-backed authorities told us that Americans were exploitative capitalists, while socialism would bring prosperity, we had seen the reality with our own eyes, she explained. We had tasted the difference between systems on our tongues. No amount of propaganda could overcome that direct experience. This immunity to counterfactual propaganda proved valuable during the Cold War, as both German states constructed competing narratives about economic systems and their outcomes. West Germans who had directly experienced American abundance were largely inoculated against Soviet claims about the superiority of planned economies. Their resistance was not ideological, but empirical. They had seen and tasted the evidence themselves. The Christmas dinners of 1945 thus represent more than historical curiosities or heartwarming anecdotes from the aftermath of war. They were moments of profound revelation that helped reshape the consciousness of thousands of Germans, confronting them with irrefutable evidence that contradicted years of carefully constructed propaganda. In breaking through these layers of deception, these simple meals accomplished what military force alone could not. They transformed enemies into allies by revealing a truth that no amount of indoctrination could permanently obscure. For historians studying this period, the Christmas dinners offer a compelling case study in how material reality can overcome ideological constructs, how the evidence of abundance can shatter myths of scarcity more effectively than any counter-propaganda. The transformation they catalyzed was not imposed from above through re-education programs or denazification tribunals, but emerged organically from direct experience, making it far more durable and internally consistent than externally imposed beliefs could ever be. 70 years later, as Germany stands as one of America's closest allies and strongest economic partners, the legacy of those Christmas dinners remains visible in the transatlantic relationship. What began with turkey and cranberry sauce in the ruins of the Third Reich developed into one of history's most successful examples of former enemies becoming steadfast friends, not through forgetting the past, but through discovering truths that propaganda had tried to obscure. In December 1945, as 6-year-old Kurt Schultz bit into an orange given to him by an American soldier, he was not just enjoying a rare treat. He was experiencing the first taste of a new reality that would help shape his country's future for generations to come. The truth revealed at those Christmas tables proved more powerful than all the lies that had preceded it, a reality that no amount of propaganda could permanently obscure once it had been directly experienced. In that sense, those Christmas dinners represent not just historical events, but a timeless lesson in how truth ultimately prevails over deception, no matter how carefully constructed or thoroughly taught that deception might be. July 9, 1943. The Sicilian sun beat down mercilessly on the coastal town of Gela, where the thunderous echoes of naval bombardment had only recently faded. Lieutenant Anthony Calabrese of the United States 1st Infantry Division stood transfixed, his weathered face registering disbelief at the scene unfolding before him. What the 32-year-old Brooklyn-born officer witnessed that morning defied 20 years of fascist propaganda about American soldiers. The lieutenant, son of Italian immigrants himself, had expected to find a population hostile to the invading forces. Instead, he watched as dozens of hollow-cheeked Italian children gathered around a Marine field kitchen, their wide eyes transfixed by something even more captivating than the food being prepared: the casual abundance displayed by the American servicemen. "They looked at our trash like it was treasure," Calabrese would later write in his field journal. Empty ration tins, discarded chocolate wrappers, even the wooden crates our supplies came in. These were items of fascination and value to kids who had known nothing but war and scarcity since birth. What struck the lieutenant most profoundly wasn't just the children's hunger. It was their complete disbelief at witnessing American Marines casually discard more food than many of them had seen in weeks. When one Marine mess sergeant, Dale Harrison, noticed a small boy no older than 7 staring at a half-eaten K ration, he didn't simply offer the child the remains. Instead, he served the boy a fresh, full meal on a clean metal tray, an act of casual generosity that left the child momentarily paralyzed with confusion. What happened next shattered years of carefully constructed fascist indoctrination faster than any propaganda leaflet ever could. After breakfast, when Staff Sergeant Michael O'Donnell pulled a worn baseball and several gloves from his pack and began organizing the children into impromptu teams, Calabrese observed something transformative. These children, who just hours before had been taught to fear and hate us as barbaric invaders, were now laughing and playing America's pastime with Marines who had stormed their beaches the previous day, he noted. The language barrier meant nothing. Baseball and food spoke volumes. This single moment on a dusty Sicilian field represented more than an act of kindness. It was the first exposure many Italian civilians had to the staggering material wealth of America, a nation that could afford to feed not only its fighting forces with abundance, but also had resources to spare for the children of its enemies. The contrast between fascist Italy's deprivation and American plenty would prove more devastating to Mussolini's regime than any military defeat. Within hours, word had spread throughout the village about the Americans' generosity, and by nightfall, the Marines' temporary camp was surrounded by families hoping for both food and confirmation of the impossible rumors they'd heard about American wealth. The scene in Gela was no isolated incident. As Allied forces pushed northward through Sicily and eventually onto the Italian mainland, similar encounters would repeat themselves thousands of times, each instance eroding Italian civilian support for the fascist regime more effectively than any political argument could. What these hungry children discovered about America through baseball and breakfast would reshape not only their immediate circumstances, but the entire course of Italian-American relations for generations to come. The Italy that these American forces encountered in 1943 bore little resemblance to the powerful, self-sufficient nation promised by Mussolini's 21 years of fascist rule. Since the dictator's rise to power in 1922, Italian state propaganda had worked tirelessly to project an image of military might and economic prosperity. Mussolini himself had famously declared that under fascism, Italy would achieve autarky, complete economic self-sufficiency, freeing the nation from dependence on foreign imports and making it the equal of any world power. Reality told a different story. By 1943, after 3 years of war, the average Italian civilian's daily caloric intake had plummeted to approximately 1,200 calories, less than half the pre-war average. In rural Sicily, the situation was even more dire, with many families subsisting on fewer than 800 calories daily, predominantly from wheat products and whatever vegetables could be grown in small garden plots. Meat had become so scarce that most children under the age of 10 had never tasted it outside of special occasions, if at all. A fascist party-issued ration card from June 1943 entitled "An Italian Adult to Merely 150 Grams of Bread Daily, 30 grams of pasta, 20 grams of fat, and 100 grams of vegetables, amounts barely sufficient to sustain life, let alone provide nourishment to growing children." By stark contrast, the standard American field ration provided each serviceman with approximately 3,500 calories daily, more than triple what the average Italian civilian received. This disparity became immediately apparent to local populations whenever American forces arrived in a new area. Private First Class James Donahue, a Marine Corps combat photographer who documented the Sicilian campaign, recalled in his memoir, "The Italian people couldn't believe what our men considered normal portions. I watched a mother weep when a cook handed her 7-year-old son a plate with what we considered a modest serving. She explained that it contained more meat than the entire family had seen in a month. The contrast extended far beyond food. While Italian children played with homemade toys fashioned from scraps, bits of wood, stone, or occasionally precious metal reclaimed from damaged buildings or spent artillery casings, American servicemen carried store-bought playing cards, harmonicas, and most remarkably to the local children, baseballs and gloves. Corporals Raymond Decker and Lloyd Miller of the 1st Marine Division had famously packed 6 baseball gloves and 3 balls into their personal gear before the invasion, sacrificing extra clothing to make room for what they considered essential for maintaining morale. This decision, made casually by 2 young men from Pennsylvania, would have profound psychological impact on the Italian children they encountered. Fascist propaganda had long portrayed Americans as culturally inferior, materialistic, undisciplined, and lacking the spiritual fortitude that supposedly characterized Italian fascism. The state newspaper Il Popolo d'Italia had regularly featured cartoons depicting Americans as gangster-like figures, obsessed with money and pleasure, morally corrupt and physically soft. Italian school children studied texts describing the United States as a failed experiment in democracy where poverty was rampant and social decay inevitable. One particularly influential school text from 1938, La Nostra Patria Superior, Our Superior Homeland, informed students that while Italians build for eternity, Americans construct disposable structures with no soul. Their cities are crime-ridden wastelands where the weak starve while the corrupt prosper. Such propaganda crumbled instantly when confronted with the reality of American abundance. When Marines from the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment established their field kitchen outside Licata on July 11, 1943, local residents witnessed something that contradicted everything they had been taught. American servicemen were not only well-fed and well-equipped, but remarkably casual about their wealth. Master Sergeant William Garretson, who supervised food distribution at Licata, recorded in his unit's daily log that his kitchen disposed of approximately 65 pounds of edible leftovers after breakfast, more food than many local families saw in 2 weeks. The military and political situation that brought these contrasting worlds together had been developing since the successful Allied campaigns in North Africa. With Axis forces defeated in Tunisia by May 1943, Allied planners had turned their attention to Sicily as the crucial stepping stone to mainland Italy. Operation Husky, as the Sicilian invasion was codenamed, began on July 10th with American forces landing near Gela and Licata on the southern coast. What military planners hadn't fully anticipated was the humanitarian situation they would encounter, and the powerful psychological weapon that American abundance would become. General George S. Patton, commanding the U.S. 7th Army during the Sicilian campaign, quickly recognized this unexpected advantage. In a communique to subordinate commanders on July 15th, Patton wrote, "The friendly reception from civilians appears directly proportional to their material needs and our ability to meet them. Every K ration shared does more to secure our position than a dozen propaganda leaflets." While Patton's primary concern remained military objectives, his acknowledgment of food as a strategic asset demonstrated remarkable pragmatism. Within days, units were informally authorized to share limited rations with civilian populations, particularly children, as a means of securing goodwill and intelligence. What began as a strategic calculation, however, soon evolved into something more profound, a genuine human connection between American servicemen and Italian civilians that would permanently alter how each viewed the other. This connection would first be forged through food, but cemented through something even more distinctly American: baseball. The morning of July 12, 1943, began like many others for 10-year-old Giuseppe Ferrara. He had risen before dawn to help his mother, Sophia, forage for edible plants along the outskirts of their village near Vittoria. The family's life had been reduced to a desperate daily search for sustenance since his father had been conscripted into the Italian army 2 years earlier. No word had come from him since the North African campaign, and the family subsisted on wild greens, occasional eggs from their 3 remaining chickens, and the meager rations provided by their fascist government-issued cards. What made this day different was the rumor that had swept through the village the previous evening. The Americans had established a camp just 2 kilometers away. Giuseppe had been raised on stories about these invaders. They were undisciplined, immoral, and would bring nothing but further hardship. Yet the whispers among adults told a different tale. The Americans had food, real food, and were sharing it with children in other villages. "I told myself I would just look," Giuseppe would recall 60 years later, in an oral history recorded by the University of Michigan's War Memory Project. "I was the man of the house, with my father gone. I needed to know if these Americans were as dangerous as we had been told." With his mother's reluctant permission, Giuseppe set out toward the American encampment, joining several other curious children from the village. What Giuseppe witnessed upon reaching the Marine position permanently altered his understanding of the world. "The first thing I noticed was the smell," he recalled. "Real coffee, bacon, things I had almost forgotten existed. Then I saw a Marine scraping leftover food from his plate into a garbage pit. There was more food in their trash than my family had eaten in 3 days. Corporal Henry Williams of the 2nd. Marine Division noticed the wide-eyed boy staring at the disposal pit and motioned him over to the chow line. Despite having no common language, Williams managed to communicate through gestures that Giuseppe should wait. Minutes later, the young Italian found himself handed a tray containing powdered eggs, 3 strips of bacon, 2 slices of white bread with butter, and a mug of sweetened coffee with condensed milk. "I couldn't eat at first," Giuseppe remembered. "I kept thinking of my mother and sisters at home. The Marine seemed to understand. He found a paper bag and helped me carefully place most of the food inside to take home. Then he sat with me while I ate a small portion there. He kept smiling and pointing at the food, then at me. His kindness made me more confused than anything. These were the terrible Americans?" After breakfast, Giuseppe witnessed something even more extraordinary. Sergeant David Landry cleared a small area and began organizing the growing group of local children into 2 lines. From his pack, he produced a worn leather baseball glove, a ball, and a crude bat fashioned from a tent pole. Through animated gestures and demonstrations, Landry began teaching the fundamentals of baseball to children who had never seen the game. "He showed us how to hold the bat, how to stand," Giuseppe said. "When my turn came, he stood behind me, adjusted my hands on the bat, and helped me swing. When I hit the ball, all the Marines cheered like I had done something magnificent. I had never felt such pride. The improvised baseball game lasted nearly 3 hours. During water breaks, Marines distributed chocolate bars and chewing gum, luxuries so foreign to the Italian children that several, including Giuseppe, initially didn't recognize them as edible. By afternoon, word had spread to the village, and mothers cautiously approached the camp. Rather than finding their children indoctrinated or exploited, they discovered them playing, laughing, and most shockingly, with visibly fuller bellies than when they had left home that morning. Sofia Ferrara, initially terrified about her son's safety, arrived to find Giuseppe demonstrating a baseball swing to his new friends. "My mother stood frozen at the edge of the field," Giuseppe recalled. "I ran to her with my bag of food and started explaining baseball with such excitement. She kept looking at the Marines, then at me, as if trying to reconcile these kind men with the monsters described by Il Dutre's broadcasts." That evening, Giuseppe emptied his paper bag onto the family's small kitchen table. His two younger sisters stared in disbelief at the white bread, something they hadn't tasted since 1940. The family divided the food with mathematical precision, creating enough meals for 2 days. As they ate, Giuseppe attempted to explain baseball, using a stick and a stone to demonstrate what he had learned. "That night," he recalled, "was the first time I heard my mother laugh since my father left. She said perhaps not everything we had been told about Americans was true." It seems so simple now, but that moment was when fascism first began to crack in my young mind. Giuseppe's experience was being replicated across Sicily. In Palermo, Catania, Messina, and dozens of smaller towns and villages, American abundance was creating a crisis of faith in fascist ideology. Captain Richard Bennett, a Marine intelligence officer, documented this phenomenon in his August 3, 1943 report. "The most effective weapon against fascist loyalty isn't found in our arsenal, but in our mess kits. Local children who interact with our men and witness our standard of living become immediate conduits of pro-American sentiment within their families. This transmission of experience does more to undermine enemy propaganda than any leaflet campaign could achieve." In the coastal town of Siaka, Master Sergeant Thomas Reynolds organized what became known as the Sicilian World Series, a 3-day baseball tournament involving over 60 local children divided into 4 teams: the Yankees, Red Sox, Dodgers, and Cardinals. Reynolds documented the event in extensive detail in his personal journal. Day 1 had to teach them everything from scratch. Most had never seen a baseball. By afternoon, they were hitting grounders and making catches that would make any Little League coach proud. The local priest stood watching for hours, initially suspicious, then openly amazed at how quickly the children adapted to the game. Reynolds continued. Day 2. Word spread overnight. Had twice as many kids show up this morning. Had to improvise with equipment, using ration tins for bases and making 2 more bats from tent poles. Set up a proper diamond with home plate and showed them how to run bases counterclockwise. Mothers began arriving with small offerings, a few fresh tomatoes, some basil, as thanks for feeding their children at lunch break. The gratitude in their eyes when we refused their gifts and instead gave them additional rations was something I'll never forget. By the tournament's final day, Reynolds noted that nearly the entire village had gathered to watch. We had Marines calling balls and strikes in broken Italian, local kids arguing close plays with the universal language of sports, and families cheering from the sidelines. The Cardinals won 7-5 over the Yankees. Afterward, we distributed chocolate bars to every participant and enough K-rations for each child to take home a meal for their family. This seemingly simple sporting event accomplished something profound. As Reynolds observed, these children have been taught their entire lives that Americans are their enemies, uncultured barbarians intent on destroying their way of life. A 3-day baseball tournament has completely shattered that narrative. They've seen firsthand our generosity, our organization, our equipment, and most importantly, our humanity. The impact extended beyond public perception. In Agrigento, Corporal Michael Rossi, an Italian-American translator attached to the 1st Infantry Division, recorded conversations with local officials who had remained in their positions after the fascist authorities fled. One mayor confided, "We were told Americans would plunder our homes and violate our women. Instead, they feed our children and teach them games. How can we maintain loyalty to those who lied to us so completely?" The contrast was particularly stark regarding children. Fascist Italy had established the Opera Nazionale Ballia, the official fascist youth organization, which emphasized military discipline, physical fitness, and absolute loyalty to the state. Children as young as 6 participated in drills, wore uniforms, and recited oaths to Mussolini. The program was designed to militarize youth culture and prepare children psychologically for sacrifice and hardship. American Marines, by contrast, interacted with Italian children through play, food, and casual kindness. They organized baseball games rather than military drills, distributed candy instead of demanding sacrifices, and treated children as children rather than mini-soldiers. This approach proved devastatingly effective at undermining years of fascist youth indoctrination. As one school teacher in Syracuse noted in a letter discovered by Allied intelligence, "My students now play Americans and fascists in the schoolyard. All wish to be Americans, none volunteered to portray fascists." This speaks volumes about the failure of our years of political education. In Catania, 11-year-old Maria Conti had spent her entire educational experience learning about American decadence and moral weakness. Her school textbooks described Americans as undisciplined, their women as immoral, their society as chaotic and crime-ridden. Then, on July 25, 1943, she encountered pharmacist's mate second-class James Wilson, a Navy corpsman attached to a Marine unit. Wilson had established a small medical aid station to treat minor civilian ailments. Maria, suffering from an infected cut on her arm, was brought there by her grandmother. "I was terrified," Maria later recounted. "I expected this American to be rough and uncaring. Instead, he spoke softly, though I couldn't understand his words, and showed me his medical equipment before touching me. He cleaned my wound with medicines I had never seen before, applied a white cream, and covered it with a bandage larger than necessary. Then he gave me a chocolate bar and a small stuffed bear from his own pack. I had never owned a toy that wasn't homemade." When Maria returned home and showed her family the stuffed bear, her older brother Paolo initially accused her of stealing it. The concept that an American soldier would simply give away such an item as a gift seemed impossible. When Maria's grandmother confirmed the story, Paolo's worldview visibly shook. "My brother had been the most dedicated Balilla member in our neighborhood," Maria recalled. "He had memorized all of Mussolini's speeches. Yet here was evidence he could not deny that everything he had been taught about Americans was false." Within days, Paolo himself ventured to the American position and found himself invited to join a baseball game already in progress. By week's end, he had become an informal interpreter for the Marines, helping them communicate with local children. His Balilla uniform remained hanging in the family closet, unworn and increasingly irrelevant. As Allied forces pushed northward from Sicily onto the Italian mainland, following the successful conclusion of Operation Husky, the pattern repeated itself with even greater impact. The contrast between American abundance and Italian scarcity became increasingly stark as the war's devastation on the peninsula's infrastructure became more severe. Each new town and village encountered by American forces presented the same scene: malnourished civilians, particularly children, confronting the shocking reality of American material wealth. The numbers revealed a truth no propaganda could hide. By September 1943, when Allied forces landed at Salerno on the Italian mainland, the average American combat soldier carried approximately 80 pounds of equipment, including uniforms made from high-quality textiles, waterproof boots, automatic weapons with abundant ammunition, personal hygiene items, water purification tablets, and rations containing more calories in 3 days than many Italian civilians consumed in 2 weeks. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Peterson, who commanded the 3rd Battalion, 7th Marine Regiment during the mainland campaign, maintained detailed records of his unit's supply consumption. In October 1943, his 1,000-man battalion utilized daily 2,700 pounds of food, 490 gallons of fuel, 300 pounds of soap and cleaning supplies, and 75 pounds of coffee. These figures represented more resources than entire Italian villages of similar size consumed in the same period. Food became the most visible and immediate evidence of American abundance. The standard K ration included items most Italian children had never seen: canned meat, powdered eggs, instant coffee, sugar packets, fruit preserves, vitamin-enriched chocolate, and cigarettes. Even C rations, considered by American troops to be barely palatable, contained more protein than most Italian families consumed in a week. Sergeant Frank Donovan, who supervised a field kitchen near Naples in October 1943, recorded in his unit journal that his kitchen prepared approximately 3,600 eggs each. Morning for breakfast, more than the entire monthly egg. Consumption of the surrounding village, with its population of 2,000 civilians. The kitchen disposal pit accumulated approximately 90 pounds of edible waste daily, scraps and leftovers that local residents soon began gathering with tacit approval from sympathetic American officers. Beyond food, the material culture of American military units presented equally stark contrasts. Private Walter Schmidt, a mechanic with the 1st Armored Division, recalled Italian children gathering to watch basic vehicle maintenance. We would change the oil in our Jeeps and trucks every 1,000 miles as standard procedure. The local mechanics who observed this were astonished. They explained that in civilian Italian vehicles, oil was never discarded, merely filtered through cloth and reused until it turned completely black. The concept of regular preventative maintenance with new parts and fluids seemed like inconceivable luxury. This material abundance manifested even in recreation. The Special Services Division of the U.S. Army documented shipping 63,000 baseballs, 42,000 bats, and 31,000 gloves to American forces in the Mediterranean theater during 1943 alone. By comparison, the entire Italian civilian population had access to fewer than 12,000 regulation soccer balls that same year, according to pre-war sporting goods industry records. Captain George Sullivan, a Marine logistics officer, noted in his November 1943 report, "The average Italian village we encounter has been surviving on approximately 700 to 900 calories per person daily. Our daily field rations provide 3,500 calories per man. We discard as waste approximately 600 to 800 calories per man daily. The mathematical reality is that our garbage contains nearly the same caloric content as their entire daily food supply. This fact, more than any propaganda, demonstrates to the local population which system, fascism or democracy, delivers material benefits. The impact of this disparity manifested not just in statistics, but in the physical transformation of Italian children who maintained regular contact with American units. In Avellino, village physician Dr. Antonio Ricci maintained medical records of 34 children who regularly visited a nearby Marine encampment between October 1943 and January 1944. His findings were remarkable. These children gained an average of 7 pounds over 3 months, a period when their peers who did not interact with American forces typically lost weight due to seasonal food scarcity. Dr. Ricci's notes, later collected by American military researchers, observed the children who visit the American camp show not merely weight gain but improved skin color, higher energy levels, and fewer minor illnesses. Most notably, they display psychological improvements, smiling more frequently, engaging in more active play, and expressing more optimistic views about the future. This transformation extends beyond nutrition to encompass a broader sense of security and hope. In Caserta, Staff Sergeant Raymond Wilson established what became known informally as baseball school, a daily 3-hour session where local children learned the game under Marine tutelage. Wilson, a former minor league pitcher with the St. Louis Cardinals organization, recorded detailed observations about his students. Week 1. Most kids too weak to swing a regulation bat or throw more than 20 yards. Provided additional rations beyond standard lunch. Week 2, noticeable improvement in energy and strength. Several boys now hitting with proper form. Week 3, running bases without exhaustion. First actual game played with full innings. Week 4, physical transformation remarkable. These kids are now athletes, not just hungry refugees. Wilson's baseball program had the unintended consequence of creating an impromptu English language school. Children eager to understand baseball terminology began learning basic English words: ball, strike, run, catch, throw, which expanded to broader vocabulary through daily interaction. By December 1943, Wilson noted that most of his regular participants could understand simple English instructions and communicate basic needs and questions to American personnel. The impact of these exchanges went far beyond immediate humanitarian relief. They represented a profound ideological challenge to fascism itself. Fascist doctrine had promised Italians that strength through discipline and nationalist sacrifice would create a superior society to democratic weakness and capitalist excess. Yet here was irrefutable evidence that American excess produced healthier children, better equipped soldiers, and more abundant resources than 2 decades of fascist discipline and sacrifice had managed to create. Lieutenant Joseph Marconi, an Italian-American intelligence officer from Chicago, conducted informal interviews with Italian civilians throughout the autumn of 1943. His reports highlighted the ideological crisis many experienced. Subject after subject expresses the same sentiment. If this is how Americans live during wartime, what must their country be like during peace? The simple abundance of our military rations, the quality of our equipment, and the general health of our troops contradicts everything they have been taught about America, being a failed society of inequality and poverty. Marconi documented numerous instances where this contradiction led to complete ideological conversion. In one notable case, a former black-shirt fascist party militia member named Giovanni Lombardi approached American lines near Cassino in December 1943, surrendering while carrying his 10-year-old son who suffered from pneumonia. Lombardi, who had been a fascist party member since 1927, explained through an interpreter that his previous loyalty to Mussolini had been shattered by a simple observation. American field hospitals had penicillin in abundant supply, while his local fascist-run medical center had not even basic antibiotics. He stated repeatedly, Marconi wrote, that no political ideology could justify his son's death when the means to save him existed just kilometers away behind American lines. The availability of medical care proved particularly devastating to fascist credibility. Navy Lieutenant Commander James Bradford, a physician with a Marine field hospital near Anzio, recorded treating over 300 Italian civilian medical cases in January 1944 alone. His medical logs note, most civilian patients express disbelief at our standard treatments. Procedures and medications we consider routine, sulfa drugs, blood transfusions, plasma, vitamin supplements, are viewed as miraculous by local people. Many report never having received professional medical examination in their lives, despite fascist propaganda claiming universal health care access. Bradford documented the case of 8-year-old Sophia Marino, who arrived at his field hospital suffering from severe malnutrition and infected wounds on her legs. Child arrived weighing approximately 38 pounds, roughly 60% of expected weight for her age. Examination revealed multiple vitamin deficiencies and improperly healed prior injuries. Standard treatment protocol implemented: wound cleaning, penicillin, vitamin supplements, and regular meals from mess tent. After 14 days, patient gained 6 pounds and showed complete wound healing. The transformation appeared miraculous to her family, though it represented merely basic medical care by our standards. The girl's father, Marco Marino, had been a mid-level fascist municipal official before the Allied invasion. After witnessing his daughter's recovery, he provided American intelligence with detailed information about remaining fascist resistance in the region. As he explained to Bradford, for 16 years, they promised us that fascism would make Italy a great power with modern medicine for all. Yet my daughter was dying from infections that your doctors cured in days with medicines you have in abundance. Every word from Mussolini's mouth was a lie. The profound psychological impact of American abundance manifested most clearly among Italian children. Having known nothing but fascist rule and wartime scarcity their entire lives, their encounter with American plenty created a complete recalibration of what they considered normal. Marine Corps Sergeant Timothy O'Brien, who organized youth activities in Naples, noted this transformation. These kids initially treated every baseball, every chocolate bar, every piece of chewing gum as precious treasures. Within weeks, they began treating these items as normal expectations. Their entire baseline for ordinary had been reset to what was previously unimaginable luxury. This reset extended to cultural perceptions. Children who participated in Marine organized baseball games began adopting American expressions, mannerisms, and attitudes. They incorporated English words into their Italian conversations, mimicked the casual confidence of American servicemen, and increasingly identified with American cultural symbols. O'Brien noted that by November 1943, many of his regular participants had created makeshift American flags to wear as armbands or bandanas, a remarkable transformation for children who months earlier had been participating in fascist youth rallies. The physical evidence of this transformation became increasingly visible. Dr. Maria Esposito, a pediatrician in Salerno, maintained growth charts for local children before and after American forces arrived. Her records showed that children who regularly interacted with American units, particularly those who received supplemental food, grew an average of 1.5 centimeters more over 6 months than those who didn't. Their weight gain was even more dramatic, with regular recipients of American rations weighing 15% more on average than their peers after 6 months. Beyond physical measurements, Dr. Esposito noted psychological changes. The children who interact regularly with Americans display notably different behavioral patterns. They engage more confidently with strangers, express more optimistic future expectations, and demonstrate greater problem-solving initiative. Most strikingly, they have begun teaching American games and phrases to children who haven't had direct contact with the soldiers, becoming cultural ambassadors for a way of life. They have only glimpsed this cascade effect, children influencing other children, who then influenced their families, proved remarkably effective at changing community attitudes toward both Americans and the fascist regime. Lieutenant William Harrison, a civil affairs officer with the Fifth Army, documented this phenomenon in his February 1944 report. Civilian cooperation increases dramatically in areas where we've established regular contact with local children, particularly through organized activities like baseball games. Parents who observe their children's positive experiences with our personnel become significantly more willing to provide intelligence about enemy movements and identify remaining fascist sympathizers. The material abundance displayed by American forces made particularly strong impressions when contrasted directly with German and Italian fascist military provisions. Captain Robert Westbrook, an intelligence officer who debriefed Italian military deserters, recorded numerous testimonies about this disparity. One Italian sergeant who surrendered near Monte Cassino in January 1944 reported that his unit had been subsisting on approximately 1,000 calories daily, primarily pasta, occasional preserved meat, and whatever local crops could be requisitioned. By comparison, the American K rations he received upon capture provided nearly 2,000 calories daily, including items his unit had not seen in months: coffee, sugar, chocolate, and cigarettes. Westbrook's reports highlighted a remarkable pattern. Italian prisoners of war often gained weight in American custody despite being captives. Medical records from POW processing centers showed that Italian prisoners gained an average of 12 pounds during their first 60 days in American custody, a profound indictment of the nutritional conditions in their own military. The mathematics of defeat were written in every aspect of material comparison. By early 1944, the average American division consumed approximately 35 tons of supplies daily, including 7 tons of food, 9 tons of ammunition, and 5 tons of fuel. A comparable Italian division received less than 12 tons daily at peak efficiency, with frequent shortages reducing this to 7 or 8 tons. As one captured Italian colonel remarked to his American interrogators, "We were not defeated by your strategy, but by your quartermasters." No military genius can overcome a 3-to-1 disparity in material resources. This material disparity extended to the most basic comforts. Lieutenant Samuel Rodriguez, who supervised a POW camp near Naples, documented the reaction of newly arrived Italian prisoners to American standard-issue items. New arrivals expressed disbelief at receiving individual blankets, soap, toothbrushes, and new socks. Several have asked if these items are reserved for officers, not believing that ordinary American soldiers receive such provisions as standard issue. When informed that these represent normal American military standards, many become visibly emotional. Rodriguez recorded the response of one Italian captain who broke down upon being issued a new wool blanket. The officer explained that in his unit, only one blanket was available for every 3 men. They had developed a rotation system, where each man received the blanket for 8 hours, while the others used their uniforms for warmth. The concept that American forces had surplus, blankets enough to provide to prisoners, represented, for him, the moment he understood why Italy had lost the war. The transformation extended beyond material provisions to cultural values. Many Italian children who regularly interacted with American forces began to internalize not just a desire for American goods, but American concepts of individual initiative and pragmatism. Captain Michael Romano, an Italian-American officer who organized youth activities in multiple villages, noted this shift. These kids initially expected everything to be organized from above. They waited for explicit instructions before taking any action, reflecting years of fascist conditioning. After weeks of baseball, they began organizing their own games, establishing their own rules, and resolving disputes without adult intervention. They were unconsciously adopting American approaches to problem-solving and self-governance. This transformation appeared in unexpected ways. In San Pietro, 13-year-old Antonio Giordano had been a model member of the Opera Nazionale Balilla, the fascist youth organization, before American forces arrived in December 1943. By February 1944, he had established his own baseball league with 27 participants from surrounding villages, complete with team names borrowed from American cities, New York, Chicago, Boston, and Philadelphia. Using equipment provided by Marines, 2 bats, 3 balls, and 4 gloves, Antonio created a rotating schedule ensuring each team received equal equipment time. When Lieutenant James Morrison observed this independent organization, he asked Antonio through an interpreter how he had developed such a system. The boy's response proved revealing. "The Americans let us figure things out ourselves. They don't tell us exactly what to do every minute like our teachers and the Balilla leaders. They show us the game, then let us play it our way." I like that better. This simple statement reflected a profound shift from fascist principles of hierarchical control to democratic concepts of individual initiative, all catalyzed by baseball and breakfast. In that moment, Morrison understood they had been fighting an enemy who had been lied to about everything. The transformation was happening not just through material abundance, but through cultural exchange, an exchange increasingly dominated by American models as fascist alternatives lost credibility. Letters home from Italian children and parents who had regular contact with American forces revealed the depth of this psychological transformation. Maria Vaccaro, a 36-year-old mother of 3 from Acera, wrote to her brother in northern Italy in March 1944, "You would not recognize your nephews now. They speak some English words, play an American game with a bat and ball, and talk constantly about visiting America someday." Filippo, who used to recite Mussolini's speeches from memory, now wears an American soldier's cap he was given and pretends to be a Marine. When I asked if he still wanted to be a Balilla leader when he grows up, he laughed as if I had suggested something ridiculous. Such transformations were occurring throughout American-occupied territories. Children who had been raised on stories of American barbarity were discovering not just material abundance, but personal kindness. This combination proved devastatingly effective at undermining fascist indoctrination. As 12-year-old Pietro Mantini wrote in a school essay collected by American civil affairs officers in April 1944, "The Americans have big trucks and many chocolates, but what I like best is they ask my name and remember it the next day. They want to know what I think about the baseball game. No adult ever asked what I thought before they came." This simple observation highlighted a profound cultural difference. Fascist youth organizations emphasized collective identity and subordination to authority. American interactions with children, even casual ones, typically incorporated questions about individual preferences, opinions, and experiences. This distinction between being treated as an interchangeable member of a collective versus being acknowledged as an individual with valid perspectives represented a fundamental ideological contrast that children intuitively recognized. The transformation from fascist true believer to American enthusiast often occurred with remarkable speed. Lieutenant Anthony DeSantis documented the case of 15-year-old Giovanni Pacelli, who had been selected for special leadership training in the fascist youth organization due to his fanatical devotion to Mussolini. Within 3 weeks of regular interaction with Marine baseball instructors, Giovanni had completely abandoned his fascist beliefs. When DeSantis asked what had caused such a dramatic change, the boy's answer was revealing. "The fascists always told us we must suffer today to be strong tomorrow. The Americans are strong today and don't seem to suffer at all. I think they were lying to us about everything." This cognitive dissonance between fascist promises of future reward through present sacrifice and American demonstration of current abundance proved impossible for many Italians to reconcile with continued loyalty to Mussolini's regime. The evidence before their eyes contradicted everything they had been taught about American society being weak, chaotic, and impoverished. Captain Frank Mitchell, who supervised civil affairs in the Campania region during early 1944, documented this ideological collapse. Fascism maintained power partly by controlling information, convincing Italians they were materially better off than other nations, particularly democracies. Direct exposure to American abundance shattered this illusion completely. Once Italian civilians saw American chocolate bars, cigarettes, medical supplies, and equipment, no fascist propaganda could convince them that Italy's sacrifices had produced superior results to American capitalism. The transformative power of this realization affected all ages but manifested most visibly in children. Lieutenant Raymond Cooper, who organized youth activities in multiple villages near Naples, observed this process. These kids are experiencing a complete recalibration of normal. Things that seemed miraculous luxuries in January, white bread, chocolate, new clothing, are now expected standards by April. Their entire framework for evaluating material conditions has shifted to an American baseline. This shift created long-term consequences for Italian society. Children who experienced regular contact with American forces during 1943 and 1944 would reach adulthood during Italy's crucial Reconstruction period and Cold War alignment decisions. Their personal experiences with American abundance created a generation predisposed toward Western democratic and economic models rather than authoritarian alternatives. The transformation extended beyond politics to personal aspirations. Dr. Elena Romano, a school teacher in Benevento, documented changing career ambitions among her students between September 1943 and May 1944. In initial essays asking what I want to be when I grow up, most boys listed military or fascist party positions, while girls predominantly mentioned nursing or teaching. By May, after months of American presence, the same children's essays showed dramatically different ambitions: business owner, doctor, baseball player, airplane pilot, or moving to America appeared frequently. As Dr. Romano noted in her personal journal, these children are not merely adopting American goods, they are internalizing American possibilities. Their entire conception of available life paths has expanded beyond what fascist education permitted them to imagine. This may prove the most lasting impact of the American presence, an expansion of perceived possible futures. This psychological transformation often manifested physically. Lieutenant Gregory Watson, a Navy medical officer attached to Marine units near Anzio, documented the health improvements of local children who received regular meals from American field kitchens. Subjects show remarkable recovery from malnutrition. Symptoms within 60 to 90 days of regular supplemental feeding. Beyond weight gain, we observe improved skin condition, enhanced wound healing, increased physical energy, reduced incidence of minor illness, and notably, improved cognitive performance and emotional stability. Watson's observations highlighted a critical point. American abundance wasn't merely creating political conversion through material incentives, it was literally transforming Italian children physically and mentally. Children who received adequate nutrition demonstrated improved learning capacity, emotional regulation, and physical development, advantages that would shape their future capabilities and perspectives. The long-term consequences of these transformative encounters between hungry Italian children and abundance-rich American forces would extend far beyond the immediate military campaign. As Allied forces pushed northward through Italy during 1944 and into 1945, similar scenes played out in hundreds of towns and villages. Each new encounter between malnourished Italian children and well-supplied American troops reinforced the same fundamental lessons about which system, democracy, or fascism, delivered material benefits to its people. These lessons would profoundly shape Italy's post-war development. Children who had experienced American abundance firsthand grew into adults with a visceral understanding of what economic prosperity and material comfort looked like. This experiential knowledge created popular support for Italy's post-war economic liberalization, Marshall Plan participation, and eventual NATO membership, policy directions that represented complete repudiation of fascist autarky principles. The baseball diamonds carved from Italian fields by Marine boots would give way to permanent facilities in the post-war years. By 1955, Italy had established 43 official baseball leagues, each tracing its origins to impromptu games organized by American servicemen during the campaign of 1943 and 1944. The Italian Baseball Federation, founded in 1950, explicitly acknowledged its debt to those first Marine organized games in its founding charter. Giuseppe Ferrara, the young boy who had first encountered American abundance outside Vittoria, would go on to study engineering at the University of Michigan on a Fulbright scholarship in 1956. In his scholarship application essay, he wrote, "My interest in America began when I was 10 years old, watching Marines build a baseball diamond from nothing but dirt and determination. They showed me that with the right tools and knowledge, anything could be built, a lesson I carried through Reconstruction and hope to further develop through American education." Maria Conti, who had received medical treatment and her first store-bought toy from a Navy corpsman, immigrated to the United States in 1952, settling in San Diego, where she worked as a nurse at the Naval Medical Center, the same facility where many of the corpsmen who had served in Italy received their training. Antonio Giordano, who had created his own baseball league in the midst of war, became a prominent business leader in post-war Naples, founding a sporting goods company that became Italy's largest importer of American baseball equipment. When interviewed for a newspaper article in 1972, he credited his success to a lesson learned from Marines. "They taught me that play matters as much as work, that finding joy even in difficult circumstances creates resilience. Most importantly, they showed me that abundance comes from productivity, not from speeches about sacrifice." The transformation extended beyond individual success stories to national relationships. Italy's post-war alignment with the United States in the Cold War derived substantial popular legitimacy from millions of personal encounters between Italian civilians and American military personnel. Statistical analysis conducted by the Rand Corporation in 1962 found that Italian regions with the highest levels of American military presence during 1943 through 1945 showed significantly stronger pro-American sentiment during the critical early Cold War period than regions with minimal American presence. The children who gathered around Marine field kitchens in 1943, watching in amazement as more food was casually discarded than their families consumed in days, grew into adults who overwhelmingly supported Italy's Western alignment during the Cold War. Their personal experiences with American abundance provided emotional inoculation against Soviet propaganda claiming American capitalism produced exploitation and scarcity. Lieutenant Anthony Calabrese, who had first documented the transformative power of baseball and breakfast in his field journal, would return to Italy in 1953 as a cultural attaché with the American Embassy. During his posting, he organized the first official Sicilian-American baseball tournament, featuring teams from 12 cities where Marines had first introduced the sport a decade earlier. At the tournament's opening ceremony in Palermo, Calabrese observed, "The fascists tried for 20 years to reshape Italian youth through indoctrination. We accomplished more profound transformation through sandlot baseball and surplus K rations in just 2 years." This observation captured an essential truth about the encounter between hungry Italian children and American abundance. Material reality proved more persuasive than any ideology. The simple act of American Marines teaching baseball after sharing breakfast accomplished what no propaganda campaign could have achieved. It demonstrated through lived experience that democratic capitalism delivered concrete benefits that fascist promises had failed to provide. The legacy of these encounters continues to shape Italian-American relations even today, embedded in family histories, cultural practices, and institutional relationships. The baseball diamonds cleared by Marine boots in 1943 have given way to modern stadiums, but they share a direct lineage. The hungry children who received their first chocolate from American hands grew into the grandparents and great-grandparents of today's Italian citizens, passing down not just stories but transformed expectations of what economic and political systems should deliver. In the small town of Vittoria, where young Giuseppe Ferrara first encountered American abundance, a baseball field built in 1952 bears a simple plaque, "In memory of the Marines who taught us to play in 1943 and showed us a better way to live." This modest memorial captures the profound legacy of those transformative encounters when hungry Italian children gathered around field kitchens and discovered not just food but a fundamentally different future than fascism had promised them. The Marines who taught baseball after breakfast accomplished something no military strategist had planned. They demonstrated that abundance could destroy indoctrination more effectively than any weapon. In doing so, they helped transform enemies into friends and authoritarian subjects into democratic citizens, one baseball game and shared meal at a time.